It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Luca Anceschi. He's actually a staff member of one of the few European universities that has a full master program in Central Asian Studies with various subdisciplines and specializations. You yourself are both a Middle Eastern Aryan specialist and a political scientist, and you have actually, your career has spanned the globe in the way that you have studied in Napoli, then Australia, and then back to Glasgow. So you are also the co-editor of the Eurasian Studies journal, one of the most esteemed journals dealing with this region in the world. And your first works were on Turkmen neutrality, and if I understood correctly, you're now working on Eurasianism. Right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So we're looking very much forward to a topic that has been very near and dear to your heart since the early 90s. So the political development of political and economic development of Central Asia.
Let's say mid-90s. I'm not that old. Okay.
Mid-90s.
That's okay.
Okay. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It is very interesting that you all made this comment about being Soviet, being post-Soviet, because the first half an hour of my lecture, we go back to the Soviet era. Obviously, the idea of this lecture is trying to presenting you with a fairly representative image of what the political economy of Central Asia is. And we really can't understand what has been going on since 1991 if we do not look back to what happened before. Not because I am nostalgic, I am exotic, but because the peculiarity of the Soviet economic structure actually defined much more than we like to think how the political economy of the region is understood today. So the lecture is divided in 3 sections, but we will have a break after the first 2. And the idea is trying to explain to all of you how different Soviet legacies in the economic realm continue to influence, even today, how these 5 republics will have will understand the political economy. Obviously, I saw a little bit of you yesterday, and you have people who are doing a PhD, people who are doing a master in area studies, people who are doing a master in other discipline, and people who are about to do a master. So I have a very mixed bag of understanding in this class. I'll try to pitch it right in the middle if I can, because obviously I am an area study lecturer at the moment. So I teach people who have done at least 4 years of East European studies. So in that sense, I can take it higher with my classes, but I have to make it to a more general level. If there is anything wrong, you can talk, because Jeroen has said that we can't really intervene, we can have a chat after that. I will also drop a few names of readings here and there. I will probably add a few, well, for sure in the handbook there will be a reading list. Oh, the kids are late, good morning, and hello. And we will also have, but we can discuss references later on. Also, since I understand there are people who are doing PhDs here, and I want this to be fruitful for them as well, I will bring some of my research in, especially insofar as Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan are concerned, because those are the countries that I work on. So I will try to be as clear as possible. I learned English in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. I come from southern Italy, and now I live in the west of Scotland. So I understand that my accent may not be very clear. If it's not, defy Euro and ask me, and I will say it again. Okay, but so let's just start now. So Soviet, post-Soviet, post-post-Soviet, how do we define Central Asia? I think that on 19th of March 2019, we have really exited the post-Soviet era. With Nursultan Nazarbayev resigning on that day, the last leader who was in power during the Soviet Union had left the field. So we now have a different elite or a different leadership in the all 5 republics, and our understanding is that even if they were trained during the Soviet Union, we really do have a kind of clear gap between what happened in the Gorbachev years, because those Niazov, Karimov, Nazarbayev, they were all Gorbachev appointments, don't forget this. And then now we have a new elite in all the 5. So analytically, those of us who are going to keep writing about Central Asia are going to be dealing with this dramatic change, this watershed. So the resignation of the last Soviet-era leader. And it creates more, if you want, conceptual issues for those of you who are tackling the region from a student perspective. Because we now have to reconcile 2 eras. We have to reconcile the Soviet era, which was long, the post-Soviet era, which is 25, 30 years almost, and now that we enter in the post-Soviet era, in which we could probably even abandon the name Soviet. How does it work? The main issue is that when it comes to politics and to economics, the legacies of the Soviet era are continuing to influence the dynamics that are happening now in the post-Soviet era. Because they were sustained, they were uninterrupted, and because, so for they significant in their time, but also for the failure of post-independent leader to engage in meaningful reforms. So the idea today is trying to assessing the importance of a number of selected economic legacies which relate to planning, management of resources, the commercial relations that they have in the post-Soviet era, so in the post-independence era. And of course, this couldn't really happen if we were not to acknowledge the centrality that authoritarianism keeps having in the region. You don't go really far analytically in the Central Asia if you do not acknowledge the fact that these are non-democratic polities who have been ruled through a kleptocratic, corrupt outlook for the good part of 30 years, with the exception of Kyrgyzstan, at some point, not even always. So if you start to understand that we've seen the consolidation of hyper-authoritarian regime in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, very personalistic, very kleptocratic, very, hyper-authoritarian. And also a softer form, but not that much softer in Kazakhstan, with the increased hardening of politics in Tajikistan. You do realize that it doesn't really make sense to divorce politics and economics. And treating economics as if it happens in a totally free market economic system, it's just fooling yourself. So you may want to correctly locate your understanding of the economic of the place within the authoritarian umbrella in which this is developing. Because don't forget, when it comes to the control of the decision-making mechanism, political, economic, social, this is the same elite. The same we have got an authoritarian political outlook, that it's also deciding how the economy is shaping up. And if you relate this unencumbered, unchallenged control over this economic dimension, you then realize that the outlook to which they do in this economic decision making is intimately related to their necessity for political survival, which means that the perpetuation of the authoritarian political system of Central Asia becomes a decisive vehicle for the economic management. So what we're going to see today, we're going to say, not only we're going to select those few Soviet economic legacies that they continue to exert influences on Central Asia. But we also focus on two particular economic policy areas, which is trade and resources. In this lecture, just to go back with what you always said before, Central Asia is both periphery and center at the same time. It's both periphery because in the first part, we will discuss Central Asia vis-à-vis the wider Soviet Union. It's central because we then, in the second part, we shift onto the region as a whole economic system, or as a ideally whole economic system, because this remains the most disintegrated part of the world. For statistically, commercially, and in other kind of areas which we will discuss later on. So, analytically, you had to move not only in time, Soviet, no, post-Soviet, post-post-Soviet, you also had to move conceptually between this being a periphery of a larger unit, the Soviet Union, and the center of the new Centralna Eurasia perspective, which is how they call themselves after 1991. Now, I know that Jeroen has said that I can ask questions, but can you just lift your hand to say if you know who this guy is? I never found any student who know it so far. Any idea? No? It is Gleb Grzyszanowski. He is the first chairman of the Gosplan when Lenin was still in power. Why this is important? It's important because in the first part of this lecture, we are going to have a brief understanding of how the Soviet economics works. This is not just because, well, there is Central Asia Studies is a discipline that can belong to Asian Studies, can work in Russia Studies Department, can work in political science. At the moment, I work in a place that used to be called the Institute for Soviet Studies. So my current understanding of the discipline is very much connected with the work of people like Alec Nove, who taught at Glasgow for a good part of 30 years. So there is the kind of institutional legacy connected with how people in my department and on my journal as well relate to Central Asian Studies. So I felt kind of compelled to give you a view of Soviet economics, which is very deeply inspired by Alec Nove, who worked at Glasgow for a good part of 30, 40 years. So in that sense, this is not anachronistic, and it's kind of funny that we're discussing Soviet economics in 2019. But it's crucial to understand the general argument of this lecture. So the problem with the Soviet economy was that it was planned. Everything was planned by people who decided, regardless of market rule, regardless of demand and supply, they were decided how the economy was to be developed. People, so central planners, republican planners, who worked across time span, they were annual, but most importantly, over 5 years. And if you think of the extent, and those, I've never been to the USSR, I'm not that old, but if you think to the extent to which that was endemic, people who have been there told me that everything from the mechanism of your watch to the kind of clothes you were wearing were decided by quotas by central planners and republican planners. So what is important about this system is that ignored the rule of the market. Ignored the rule of the market to an extent to which it didn't really matter whether people wanted something or not. If the planner decided to have it, that was going to happen. So when you replicate this planning system from central level, the Soviet Gosplan, all Union Gosplan, to the 15 Gosplan of the 15 republics, you then have and then you start to have quotas distributed across 5 years plan, the Petiletka, and then the annual plan. You realize that there is an increasingly unmanageable number of interrelated decisions that may happen. And it becomes unmanageable and difficult to be unfolding in a way that is conducive to the common good. So that's probably the first main issue of the planning, is that so the absence of market forces creates an artificial system in which every kind of supply and demand was ignored so that the whole economy was decided by planners. This is complex not only at central level, but it becomes more complex at a peripheral level, because the people who worked in the ghost plan of the Kazakh SSR, the Turkmen SSR, and the other three, they had to enforce quotas that were artificially almost decided somewhere else, periphery. In so doing, you see a whole kind of perverse dynamic instigating. The first one is the complete subjugation of local economies to those who were the needs of this unified system, which means that your economy only exists within the central planning system, but also only exists within a whole. The Soviet Union was never established to be destroyed. The Soviet Union was meant to be forever. So all these mechanisms that were perfected, well, if that's the word you're looking at, during the 70 years were meant to promote the joint economic connection of this union. And to that end, there weren't really principles of sustainability, economic autarky, economic independence, commercial freedom with these 15 republics. They were meant to exist only within this planning system, producing resources or products, if you were more lucky, that were relevant only insofar as they were distributed within this planning system. That is the first main legacy, that we got the economies of 5 states who reluctantly became independent. They were essentially shaped by the needs, by the agendas. They were set within this spatially complex and chronologically divided economic system. So in that sense, the economy of the Kazakh SSR or the Tajik SSR were only meant to work within the constraint imposed by 5-year planning articulated in 5 one-year plans into the economic system, which means that all of the mechanism in which goods, the little services they had, and the little capital they had was circulating during the Soviet Union were meant to serve the Union as a whole, and not the individual needs of what the Kazakh SSR could have been, the Tajik or whatever it is, 30 years ago. So so we have this very important division between what the central planners wanted and what the regional republics could actually enforce. And obviously this connection there happens not only because the republics in Central Asia, the Soviet era, had the very straitjackets of a specific number of economic tasks to perform, which is mostly providing natural resources. From the Turkmen and Kazakh SSR, we have mostly minerals, oil and gas. The Uzbek offer cotton, and the others too would offer the little agricultural production they could have. So the Soviet division of labor, let's call it like that, did relegate Central Asia to the first phase of production. You give us your primary sources, we will refine them, manufacture them, make it better somewhere else in the Union. So, and this has opened up another dimension to what we're saying, is that since everything was centralized and centrally planned for peripheral distribution, we then have the progressive creation of an infrastructure network that is periphery unfriendly, which is just based on the distribution ideas and needs of this wider union. In other words, everything had to go through the center, both conceptually in terms of reporting, but also physically in terms of pipelines, freeways, railroads that connected the goods produced down in Central Asia, still periphery, to the center of the Union. The first part of what I was saying, the fact you had to report how much you produce, instigated the kind of perverse dynamics that led to the Uzbek cotton scandal in the 70s and 80s, in which what they realized is that the Uzbek leadership were grossly falsifying cotton quotas produced, and then they were sort of either lying for sure to the central planners, but also in pocketing the money that were distributed for that kind of quotas. Because the quotas were everything. So in this system, in which Aleknov defined it as centralized pluralism, the planning system, you then realize that the central idea that there has to be a final number associated with what you produced was the key issue. That's what the ultimate goal towards which your entire economic planning has to go. So this is the kind of, and you can read more about how the four pillars in which this system was organized. I mostly focus on planning because I really want you to have the kind of infrastructure conceptuals that allows you to understand the next two slides. There are essentially maps. And what you could see here, this is the Soviet Union as a whole. And this from the 80s. So it's kind of taking a snapshot of whatever happened at the end of the Union era. And so if we focus on Central Asia, this is you see Kazakhstan, that's the part of the world we're interested in, roughly. And what we see is that, so look at this picture not only with the colors, but also with the lines. The lines are how resources produced in Central Asia were carried out in the Soviet system. And as you could see, the density of this kind of pipeline network doesn't really replicate here, which is the very first conclusion you can draw from this map, that the resources that were extracted in this wide, across Turkmenistan and see the Caspian Sea there, and Kazakhstan, were not meant to be refined down there. So the first problem is what kind of workforce do you need to train to do that? Not very sophisticated. You need to have people who get the gas and the oil into the pipeline, and that's it. There is no industrial benefit from reducing your own economy to the extraction of resources. And what's important also, the second conclusion, is the fact that this system was meant to be functional only through the Soviet understanding of borders, which was that borders were fictional when it comes to internal SSR borders. So these pipelines, even if they were carrying through different SSRs, they were essentially domestic pipelines, which instigate no request for transit fees, no request for international agreement, no request from any kind of negotiation. They were flowing through the same territory that they always had. So to me, it not only the relegation of Central Asia to the very first phase of production not only limited the technological capacity of local labor to the most elementary phase, it only established a infrastructure network in energy sector that was meant to stipulate almost stipulate the primacy of all union economic interests. In other words, these resources were meant to go from here to here and then sold everywhere else, with the people who own the land of the resources not having a say about what was going on. That's the second map. That really shows different colors how, and this is from the same era, so it's also is a very similar picture to what would happen at the end of the 80s when the union disintegrated. So this tells you how the land was used. And you could see that the great part of Central Asia was this yellow color, which is this desert pasture for the kind of low-intensity nomadic husbandry that they have, both in the far-flung part of Kazakhstan, but also in the Jailo system in Kyrgyzstan. And you have a little bit of fruit and cereal, but also cotton in this part of Central Asia. So in that sense, we have an extremely simplified economic structure in which these republics were assigned very strict roles in the economic planning system, with quotas, with direction of trade, with structures of trade that were not really decided by the people who were in the region, but were decided by people who were somewhere else. Now, just a specific here. When I just expose the center and the periphery, I am not really saying that the Central Asian Soviets had no say in all of this. In fact, I don't want you to think that everything was decided in Moscow and nothing got decided in Almaty, Tashkent, or whatever it was. There is a significant part of the Central Asian Soviet elite who is as responsible as this, as the central planners. Because there were reasons of political convenience, of career advancement, or even ideological belief in this system that established a very significant class of Central Asian Soviets who benefit from the system. If we don't have to orientalize a centralized Central Asia, we don't have to do it in any direction, which means not only we don't have to treat it as a weak place of the world, but we also have to recognize agency, policy agency to the locals in every kind of policy area and any kind of era, which means that the Central Asians were responsible to some extent of their own fate within the constraint of the Soviet system. So, to me, these two maps, once you will look them in the slides as being, as a one after the other, you would realize that if there is a hierarchy of structure of production in the Soviet era, Central Asia was right at the bottom. The problem with this is that the persistence of economic planning and the continuation of centralized pluralism when it came to decision was meant to work only within a system of unified economic cooperation. So you can produce oil, you can produce gas, you can produce cotton, but the progress that was instigated by the Soviet Union did create needs artificially set outside of the market logic for a more composite economic activity, which means that you couldn't just live off oil and gas. You had to receive other kind of goods because that's how it was going. There was a progress going on. So in that sense, you now have the second dimension, the second legacy we're talking about, which is the creation of a totally dysfunctional commercial system that not only happened with artificially set prices. So our understanding of prices now in 2019 is supply and demand. You want more, you pay more, there is more, you pay less. Whereas in the Soviet time, it wasn't like that. The price was set artificially by planners, regardless of needs, supply, demand, availability. Those were the prices, which obviously complicated the establishment of a functional commercial system, because this system was meant to operate within the USSR at artificial prices for things for which there was no supply and demand. You can see you can start to see the irony here. These republics were linked to a system in which they had no say about what they could actually get, because it was all provided by them by central planners. The reason of this map, I just realized, is obviously from my PhD thesis, because Turkmenistan is in dark, tells you two stories. The first story is that for both geographical reasons, economic sophistication, and you have one republic only, which is Soviet Russia, that had a more balanced trade balance, which means that they were importing from and exporting to a more significant group of non-Soviet partners. I mean, East-West trade is only a thing from the 80s, from the 70s onwards, which means they were probably just trading with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and all the satellite system, and a little bit with Cuba and Vietnam, but not much more. Whereas in cases like the Central Asians, you have 80% plus of trade being conducted with Soviet republics only, which creates two kinds of idiosyncrasies. The first one is the fact that the direction of trade is determined by the structure of trade, which is a normal market rule. But when these two elements are determined by a central planning system, you would realize how there is no room for economically diversifying what you can produce. And in turn, you can't really change your partners. So there is a constraint imposed by this. So the planners determined how the trade was to be, what to trade, how to trade, prices, where to trade. So this system worked only when those borders, those internal Soviet borders, remained domestic borders. When those became international, you start to have a very convoluted and cumbersome trading system, in which not only prices all of a sudden, and now we're moving towards the post-Soviet era, all of a sudden became global prices, which create winners, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, because they had oil and gas that were traded at much higher prices than they were traded in the Soviet times. And also losers, which are the other three, because even cotton, but also fruit and vegetables, were traded at much lower, the prices were much less different. So, in that sense, when the Soviet Union collapsed, 70 years of economic planning, 70 years of centralized pluralism, 70 years of an artificially set numbers of quotas, production, but also of economic roles, did really impact negatively on the capacity of these states to advance to a global commercial system. Which means that when we enter in, as we are now, the post-Soviet era, we had to ask ourselves, how have these legacies being tackled, understood, circumvented by the post-Soviet leaders? How have the post-Soviet leaders framed commercial policy in order to overcome those legacies? So part two, which is the one before the break, is going to be about the direction of trade. Part three, which is after the break, is going to be about the structure of trade. And in fact, it will focus on resources only. Because I think that it's important that we recognize that there has been a failure to reform the system. And this is no longer the center fault, the Moscow's fault. It's the fault of localism in Central Asia. So what I want you to do in the next two slides, is kind of have a bit of a chart about how trade is understood now. The biggest fact in the last 25 years is the progressive substitution of one dependency pattern to another one. So as we saw before in the last slide, in Anceschi's Central Survey article, you did have a commercial outlook in Central Asia that was essentially centered only on Soviet pattern, which means that Central Asia were dependent on trade with Soviet republics. What we have in the last 10 years especially is the emergence of a duopoly in terms of commercial partnership. Moscow, Russia on the one hand, and China on the other. There hasn't been that much diversification. So in that sense, you have the substitution on one centers or with a couple of main customers. Also, what we're going to talk about here is mostly formal trade. But those of you who have been to Central Asia and just go to the bazaar, you realize that informal trade is even more important. People who do the shuttle trading, they go to the borders, pick up a few goods in those bags, and they carry it through. That's not something which is registered and captured by these statistics, but is critical for the survival of families who spend days and weeks to travel from as far as the Turkmenistan to China to get the cheapest goods at Horgos, at the China-Kazakhstan border. So, but when it comes to this kind of official trade statistics, we do realize that there is a rapid rise of China's imported in Central Asia. This has to do, not to my mind, not very much with Belt and Road, but it has to do much more with the fact that China got an incredible surplus of goods manufactured internally, which then get flood into Central Asia through official and unofficial channels. Because if statistically we look at the role of Kazakhstan in the One Belt, One Road, Kazakhstan is the first country in the One Road, because China borders with Kazakhstan at the Xinjiang point of entry. We haven't really seen, and that's what my research is about at the moment, an increase in demand in Kazakhstan for Chinese goods. So these goods just transit through Kazakhstan. And the idea of having Kazakhstan as a bridge between East and West, as Nazarbayev always told us, is rapidly transforming Kazakhstan as a vessel to bring goods from East to West, without really seeing those goods being sold within Kazakhstan. So this has to do with the local surplus, with the medium range shuttle trade, with the fact that China is so close and so cheap, rather than with the progress related to One Belt, One Road infrastructure and development. Also because when you do not reform your economy, when you do not, as a policy planner, significantly change the way in which your own production structure is organized, you really cannot diversify your trade. Because here you have, in most cases, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, selling the same things they were selling 30 years ago, resources. So in that sense, you are forced to have the same partners because the pipelines are still there. The most enthusiastic of you at this point should really have, really have a chat about, is the Eurasian Economic Union helping the sort of reform of these structural patterns? Well, no, it's not. In fact, the post-Crimea data when it comes to EU trade shows that only a very small portion of the trade of the 5 partners actually happens with EU partners. So they keep trading with each other, with other partners. Now, imagine the replication of the same patterns in the European Union. It wouldn't take us as far as we are now. So states who do not trade with each other are more, will encounter many more problems when it comes to integrate the markets, the financial system, the capital system, the service markets later on. So why so? So here we really have, I mean, look at Russia. Russia, not even 10% of what they do relates to the EU commercially. In the case of Kazakhstan, it's not much different, but in the opposite direction from the statistics that we saw for the Soviet era, which means that this diversification is only has to do with the fact that the EU post-Crimea has become an empty vessel of geopolitically, pursuing the geopolitical interests of a specific part of the Russian elite, but also addressing short-term concern, which in the case of the 2 Central Asian members relate on the one hand to the access of Kyrgyz labor migrants to Russia with no visas, but also to the fact that there is a significant part of the Kazakh economy that may want not to lose those. I mean, think about it. If you read the treaty of the EU, the Eurasian Union, they want to establish the same market that we have in the European Union eventually. So, which means that there shouldn't be borders. Well, try to get a taxi between Almaty and Bishkek, even now. You still do the usual. So those borders, if you read the treaty signed by all of them, shouldn't be there, but they are still there. And no longer than what, 2 years ago, we had a lot of fruit, a lot of vegetables rotting at the Kyrgyz border because there was this spat between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan about the perceived influence Nazarbayev may or may not have had in the Kyrgyz elections. So this is not the solution to the trade problem Central Asia has. What's the solution? The solution could be trading with each other. So having a more unified Central Asia-based market of 5 states that are geographically adjacent, they are relatively compatible, but they could trade with each other. And that's probably the most important conclusion that you could draw by observing the economic policies of post-Karimov Uzbekistan, in which the president, Mirziyoyev, who's certainly not Mandela in terms of political reform, is authoritarian modernizer, but understood the fact that by opening up to the region, he can instigate a whole series of virtuous economic dynamics that could in turn addresses this structural deficit and commercial deficit that continue to affect Central Asia commercial outlook. Now I give you a 5-minute break and we can then come back with the same part. Before the break, can we do questions now? Yes, okay. So have you got any questions? Or was I super clear and I don't really need any? Yes.
Do you see a difference or a parallel with real colonies, like I'm talking African colonies, Asian colonies of Western imperial powers, that their economic extractive policies were more like in sync with world prices, and not as like absurdly or like within the Soviet bubble? Do you really see that, or were they to a certain extent also just about extraction and the missing
Look,
local needs?
I think that the comparison between the Soviet Union as a colonial power and the traditional Western powers has to be, it can't be taken for granted. They are very two different structures. Also because we had to acknowledge, I was saying before, the fact that there was an elite in Central Asia benefiting from that kind of, but also there was a significant progress, social progress made during the Soviet times. I think that your question can be answered only if we look at the absurdity of the price system, which really, I mean, if you read a Soviet economic book, you realize that these people, for good or for bad, they believe that this was never to end. So this was never to end, and the more the revolution would advance, the more countries would become part of that system, which is not really what the colonies operating, because for them it was just about getting the resources out. Okay, whereas here you had a more of a difficult, or a different kind of mission. This doesn't really mean that the use of resources wasn't thought of with kind of colonial or semi-colonial ideas in mind. The problem is that whereas decolonization in most cases involved the agency of the decolonizers at local level, desovietization in Central Asia was not pursued through the agency of the local leaders, which means that if they could have stayed, if they would have stayed, which is not just a difficult mechanism to digest unless you really verse in what happened in 1890-91, but it creates a whole series of difficult political choices. So, I mean, that's Harry Hale, who demonstrates that the more pro-Soviet you were in 89 to 91, so referendum and stay in sovereignty, the more likely to be pro-CIS you would be in those in the next CIS, in Communist Independent State, in the first 5 years. So a pro-Soviet internal debate resulted almost invariably in a very unionist foreign policy, which means that they kept moving away the possibility of having economic reform. Think about the currencies. The currency, Kazakhstan only reluctantly accepted the tenge in November 93. They were forced to do that, in fact. They could have stayed. So, no, I think that, I know that there is a lot of literature that compares Central Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa especially, but I think that those people do not really have a comprehensive look at the different nature. I mean, the periphery, yes, operated very similarly, but there is a fundamental difference at the center level. Okay. Other question? Did you have a question, Babna? No? No?
Yeah, I mean, the very last statement that you made talking about Uzbekistan,
yeah.
you talked about this virtual politics of reform
yeah.
and other things, and then you quickly, I mean, I guess you had your eye on the clock, so you decided to end it.
Yes.
This is a very fascinating point.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
I
so
just wanted some more elaboration. Maybe you're planning to do that with me.
No, I'm not actually. So it's good. Yeah. So
If I can just highlight 1 second. And earlier, and you started by saying Kazakhstan and departure of Nazarbayev as a seminal moment. Has he really departed?
Okay. So I'm gonna.
He has elevated himself to a.
I'm gonna answer the two questions. Okay. So You know, political science are very well known to always make their own prediction. And I made many, especially when it comes to my own country voting patterns. But I got it right once. And I was on record in 2016, because I wrote an article with Radio for Europe, Bruce Panier, about the fact that there was a transition going on in Kazakhstan. So we wrote in September 2016, say that Nazarbayev was going to leave. And we got it exactly right. The only thing that we got wrong is the timing. I thought it was going by Christmas 2016. It went this year. So in that sense, I think that there is a transition team that has been dealing with Kazakhstan leadership affairs for the last 2.5 years. And the last 2 prime minister appointments, now it's Mamin and before it was Agintayev, actually were related to Karim Asimov's decision to go at the backdrop. Now, the current prime minister was in the primary school class with the KGB, with Karim Asimov head. So in that sense, you really see the clientele pattern there. So I do not think Nazarbayev is calling a shot. I think that Nazarbayev actually exited in the last 2.5 years, yet to negotiate his exit with the people. And of course, I have no proof for that. But all I can tell you is that the structural context in which succession unfolded did have one single warrior on Nazarbayev's side, his family. He knew, he wasn't happy with, well, he wasn't happy, he was very negatively impressed by how the Uzbek transition went, with Gulnara not even allowed to go to her father's funeral. And we know how Central Asians feel about family. So I think that in the last 2.5 years, he did negotiate that kind of soft exit for his family with this elite. So I am probably an outlier in this, but I do not think that Nazarbayev is calling the shots. Now, when it comes to the Uzbek transition, I've done quite a bit of writing in, like on open democracy and all these kind of commentaries about the fact that I see what's happening in Uzbekistan not as a reform process, not as a regime change, but as a process of authoritarian modernization, which is very similar, not identical, but very similar to the reforms of the first Putin term, in which we do see a number of policy decisions being made by Mirziyoyev that are meant to transform the essence of his regime without really changing the governance. He talks about socio-economic transformation, he talks about fighting corruption, he talks about globalization, he doesn't really talk about political reform. So to me, that's the first indicator that is not very different from the others. He identified that there is a successful model of authoritarianism in Central Asia, and that's the Kazakhstani model. So what I think is that the ultimate goal of Mirziyoyev is to globalize Uzbekistan, modernizing the economy, opening up to foreign investors, but not really liberalize the political arena. Which, if you think about it, is what Kazakhstan used to be 15 years ago. So he's trying to replicate that kind of economic authoritarian model without having the resource, the oil, the gas, the oil in particular. So it is very challenging. But I think it's the most fascinating process currently playing in Central Asia, because the people seem to be on board. The people seem to be we don't really know whether or not everyone feels the same, but there is enthusiasm in Uzbekistan, which we don't really see in Kazakhstan anymore after the transition. Okay. Anyone more? Yes.
Just one short question about, you said that the end of the leaders of the Soviet period after the Nazarbayev's decision.
Yeah.
And how about the continuation of the same circle, for example, in Turkmenistan?
Yeah.
The policymakers around Niyaz and Iran, Ibn Khamir
Yeah.
are the same thing.
Yeah, so the fact that the leader changes doesn't really mean that the regime has changed. So governance methods, authoritarian outlooks, economic kleptocracy continue on. So what we've seen so far in Central Asia is, when it comes to Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, we've seen leadership change without regime change. The exception to this norm, of course, is Kyrgyzstan in the two revolutions, which tells you one thing, that there is not a locally born praxis for political change in no traumatic terms. So every time we've seen meaningful political change was always traumatic. So with the revolutions, which is a problem because it's now 30 years across 5 landscapes. So you are right, Turkmenistan is the example of continuity. They continue to, of course, regimes are cyclic. So you got the consolidation yesterday, you got the Berdi Muhamedov has to be legitimate. So becoming now, 15 years later, how Niaz used to be at the end. But there is not a praxis for governance change in the region without traumatic events. Because also the systematic obliteration of institutional practices and constitutional dictates actually makes all of these instruments quite irrelevant. They all have a constitution, they all have elections, they all have sort of rule of law structure, but they were never implemented because they are authoritarian by outlook. Time for one more, time for coffee. Coffee? Yeah, okay, so we can reconvene in 5 minutes? Okay, good.
Can you
Yeah.
do that